Hey, welcome to Ask Chuck Dixon 12. Done 12 of these. This might be the last one I offer free here on YouTube because I do have my own subscription channel over on Unauthorized. But let's get to it. Thank you so much for these questions. Doug Turner asks, why are so many writers today scared of the narrator's voice and only attempt to write in a cinematic style that emulates TV and movies? It's because they don't understand the medium. They don't understand how comics work. They're basically thinking of how they can pitch stuff to Netflix. So many um, comics book people have one foot in Hollywood as well, and they just see comics as an entree, as a tool to help pitch a project, rather than an end product in itself. I like narration captions; they're valuable. You can't overuse them though. And they replaced the thought balloon. The thought balloon was just it had its day. You know what I mean? It doesn't work anymore. It seems too comic booky. It seems too unsophisticated. And what other fictional medium do you know all of the characters' thoughts at any given time? There's also a bit of a crutch, a little bit lazy. You know, look, these guys are getting terrible news, but they're not really reacting emotionally in any way. The emotion's all up in the thought balloons. It's like they're so uptight they can't look shocked, but they can think about it. It's just a little silly. And Stan Lee, for my money, I love Stan Lee, but he overused it a bit. When he would have Daredevil fall off a building and he have thought balloons about which way he should turn his hips, and if I can only strike my shoulder on that flagpole, whatever. It just got a little bit silly, and it covered up a lot of beautiful artwork. I use narration more often than any other tool. I don't use it all the time, but in characters like the Punisher, we really want to know his inner thoughts. But of course, Punisher is a sociopath. He's a damaged guy, so even his thoughts aren't really accurate to what's going on, and that's where I would have the fun. He had a dry sense of humor, but it really isn't a sense of humor. Punisher's being perfectly serious, but in juxtaposition, the things he's saying are funny, because so often he would, we would read his thoughts about something, or his remembrance, because these are supposed to be journal entries, his remembrance of events, and then in juxtaposition, we would see what they're actually like. So he would use euphemisms or soft pedal, or just have this like sort of workman-like way of describing what he was doing. And then in the pictures, we see how horrific, how much danger he was in, or how much punishment he was inflicting on his enemies. And that a lot of humor could be derived out of that contrast. Um, Now, a lot of writers write and they want to be cinematic, but they don't seem to understand what that means. Comic books are not a series of little television screens, or little movie screens. Comics is a different medium, and you need to exploit that when you're a comic writer and a comic artist. And one of the things you need to do is you need to move the camera around. And because the camera is in the artist's head, they can move it wherever they want. So even in a scene like this, where it's just two people talking, here Graham Nolan keeps it interesting. He moves the camera around. He gives us different angles. He isolates the characters. He draws in closer for emphasis. Same thing here. Jordy Bernay. It's just guys sitting at a table talking. It's a quiet little moment, but it's so beautifully portrayed. We get the sense of place. We get the sense that we're there, and the dialogue carries the story, but not by itself. The visuals have to carry the story. The dialogue is there to enhance, or give the reader just enough information to understand what they're seeing in the picture, but no more. But so many people think they're trying out for a David Mamet contest in comics, and they do TV and movie type dialogue that simply doesn't work in comics. It just takes up space, takes up time, pads the story out. Look, as beautiful as this artwork is, it's just not an interesting panel. It's just two people. This could be a selfie. You know what I mean? So you don't want to do that. This kind of stuff, it's just padding. What is this? What her expression is the same in panel 3 as it is in panel 1. Where's the emotional content here? You know, so it's just they're trying to make it look like a TV show or a movie, and all they're doing is creating dull comics. So yeah, comics are cinematic, but look at Will Eisner, look at Milton Caniff. Don't look at current comics that are just what do they call it? The decompressed storytelling. Decompressed storytelling is padding. That's all it is. Because you can be cinematic and still be moving the story along, still be giving the reader that immediate experience, that visual eye candy they need to draw their eyes down the page and onto the next page. Why the hell you would want to read the next page of this, I have no idea. The guy takes a pill. I guess something happens, but we all take pills, and nothing that interesting happens afterwards. Well, I guess that depends on the pills, right? Okay, next question. Michael Hutchison. Chuck, here's a writing question. Well, that's good. How do you plot out your 22-page comic to fit? Do you do a lot of pre-planning? You've always struck me as a just start telling the adventure guy. How often have you found that you were too long or too short, had to rewrite the comic? Well, I'm terrible at giving other writers advice because seriously, comic book writing is in my DNA. It's just part of my genetic makeup. It's just a natural talent I have. Like those disgusting people who can pick up any musical instrument and just begin playing it, or can play a song by ear, or recite long poetry stances that they've learned years ago. Party trick people. My party trick is I can write comics. I don't think I've ever, very rarely have I gotten to page 22 on a comic and go, oh, or I should say page 20. I don't know where to go. I don't know how to end this. I always seem to know instinctively the story will fit. That doesn't mean I don't have some anxiety at the beginning. That is this going to work as a 6-issue miniseries? Is this going to work as a 22-page story? Yeah, but I kind of think about that ahead of time before I ever sit down to write. And if I ever do come up short, there's always something in the story I can go back to and expand upon, or a lot of times just give the artist a little more breathing space on a sequence. Map a sequence out a little bit better so it takes up 2 pages instead of 1. But only if it's a worthy sequence. I'm not going to go back and pad, but there might be something that I sort of glossed over or gave short shrift to, and now I have the luxury of going back and really exploring it, telling it either in a completely different way or simply expanding upon it. And that's part of the joy of rewriting. Well, there's no joy in rewriting comics because it's very mechanical. Rewriting prose is a joy because you don't have to worry about panels and pages, but you've got to when you rewrite a story, you've got to go back and renumber everything, rearrange everything by page, which is a little bit of a pain, but it's got to be done. Rewrites got to be done. There's those notes. I gotta change things because of the notes. But mostly you're right. I just find a strong opening, and if you got a strong opening in comics, it's clear sailing. You've introduced the reader, you've engaged them. Now it's your job to keep it going. The other thing you've got to infuse the story with is action. Look here, the JSA sitting around a table. Well, who wouldn't want to read a comic about a bunch of guys in weird costumes sitting around a table? No, you want to read this. You got to have people moving around. You've got to have action, even if it's a talking scene. Like I said, answered in the other question. Even if you have a talking scene, just move the camera around or have them doing something. As simple as pouring a drink or shuffling cards or washing a car. Just something, not just sitting talking or just walking through some generic background talking. Have them doing something. It's a visual medium, people. You've got to move that eye on the page. You've got to keep the reader moving the eye on the page. Okay, Michael Hutchison again. Can you tell us stories about watching grindhouse movies, and why did grindhouse, Death Proof, Planet Terror movie fail from the perspective of one who loves grindhouse movies? Well, not everybody loves grindhouse movies. This was the most notorious grindhouse movie in Philadelphia when I was growing up, and I never set foot inside of it. That's how notorious it was. Um, you know, you could see a lot of shocking things happening in the audience, not just up on screen. But I worked across the street from the Apollo for a long time, and man, they just had every like nasty Italian horror film, you know, every kind of exploitation film you could imagine. They'd stick those posters out. Boy, I wanted to see those movies, but I wasn't going to set foot in there. Where I did go, my local grindhouse was the Eric Terminal. The Eric Terminal was a fixture in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and it was usually a triple bill, and it ran continuously. They did this for decades. The theater would open at 11 in the morning and just go on, just show movie after movie. They never turned the lights on. I never saw the interior of that theater. It was a big theater. Never saw the interior of this theater, and it was kind of in a basement, and it was called the Terminal Theater because it was literally underneath the trolley terminal. This trolley is above that theater. It would run above the theater, and as the trolleys would go in and out, you would hear them through the ceiling of the theater through the movie, sort of sense around, providing a subwoofer experience at the old terminal. And you know, it would be a triple bill, 3 movies, and if they had trouble setting up the reels for the next movie, they just put on anything. I mean, I remember sitting through a 20-minute featurette about the Ford Motor Company one time. The audience was blue collar inner city, 69th Street, the 69th Street area, which is where this was set, was the world's first planned shopping district, and it was on the border between Upper Darby, a suburban community, and West Philadelphia. And so a lot of guys would come over from West Philadelphia to go to the terminal. Often I was the only white guy in the theater because they show a lot of black exploitation, whatever. And these were great. It was a great audience to see movies with. There was a lot of audience participation. These triple bills of action films would be very, very interactive. and it's just some great times. And there were no rules at the terminal. You would, you know, you generally the place, if you were there around lunchtime, you would hear the paper rattling, and the whole theater would fill with the odor of hoagies. So everybody ate their hoagie while watching the movie, and there were no ushers or anything at this theater to tell you no outside food or anything like that. But many, many, many hours spent there watching all kinds of films, from, you know, black exploitation, kung fu movies, spaghetti westerns, horror, and I think half of the Bronson movies I've seen I saw at the terminal. Sometimes they would have Charles Bronson or Clint Eastwood triple bills at the terminal, and you just literally spend all day there. Just go and you'd spend all day. And I never saw anyone at the concession stand. I think the popcorn. I mean, I've been going there since I was a kid. My dad took me there a couple of times to see Sword and Sandal movies, and I think that the popcorn in the bin was the same popcorn that was there when I was a kid. I never saw anybody buy anything there. Everybody brought their own hoagies and drinks. And it's for you music fans. The Eric Terminal is just down the street from the legendary Tower Theater, which was an old movie palace that turned into a music venue. I saw a lot of concerts there. David Bowie, the Kinks, but tremendous music venue that you know, I think most people that liked 60s, 70s, 80s music are very, very much aware of the fabulous Tower Theater. Robert Bavington writes, my question is, I've seen you mention that Carl Barks is one of the greatest comic creators we've ever had. Could you elaborate on why and perhaps enlighten us who were weaned on Marvel DC as to what makes his work so great? Well, Carl Barks was a Disney animator and gag man who really didn't want to be an animator or a gag man. You know, he didn't want to think of one more gag featuring, Pluto and an umbrella. Uh, he was uncomfortable in that system. He liked to tell stories. He wanted to be, a story guy, and mostly I think he wanted to work on his own. And he was allowed to do that when Dell Comics started up the Walt Disney Comics and Stories, and eventually Donald Duck Comic Magazine and Uncle Scrooge Comic Magazine. And what Barks did was he invented comic book writing. If you look at comic book writing at the time of Carl Barks, it's all pretty miserable. It's pretty bad. It's bad stuff. It's written by guys who would rather be writing for newspapers or writing for the pulps or writing novels. It's a very down rent market. Guys worked under pseudonyms because they were ashamed of working in it. And Barks shows up, and he's liberated because he can work on his own. He can take these Disney characters anywhere he wants to take them, write any kind of stories that he wants to write, and it's his total creative freedom. And he also draws the stories as well, and that's, to me, that's pure comics when the guy writing it actually draws it as well. You've got one mind here at work, and he really takes the job earnestly, sincerely, and he begins to create these amazing epic comic book stories about Donald and Uncle Scrooge and his nephews. And he creates an entire universe, a city called Duckburg, and recurring characters and all the rest of it. And he pays a lot of attention to continuity, which this is pretty much for the first time. I mean, continuity was willy-nilly in comics throughout the Golden Age. They just changed things as they needed to be changed. As new writers came on board, they knew the concept, but they hadn't read the work that came before. They weren't fans. They didn't care. They just, okay, our man, the guy takes a pill and he's got powers. Okay, wait, whatever, and just write the story. But Barks wasn't like that. He took this job conscientiously, and he infused the stories with lots of things he was interested in, ancient history and culture and travel and exotic locales, and, these tremendous mysteries. And he was an amazing comics plotter because he knew how to introduce elements that would come up later as a surprise. He knew how to build suspense, this sense of wonder, this sense of exploration that was in so many of his stories. And for an entire generation of readers, these were kids for the most part, they didn't know Carl Barks's name. Carl Barks's name wasn't uncovered till like the 60s by fans, just basically did detective work to find out who did these stories. He was simply known as the Good Duck Artist, or the Good Duck Stories. And the signature of this is that little pie slice out of the black of the eye. That's how you knew it was Carl Barks. And his readers, began to seek out these stories and enjoy these stories. And I know this for a fact because long before I knew Carl Barks's name, one of my sisters, I had two older sisters, one of the boyfriends, he knew I liked comics. He says, well, you should read the Good Duck Stories. And he actually called them that. These are the good Donald Duck stories. And I didn't know what he was talking about. And I really, I was into Spider-Man and Fantastic Four. I didn't know anything about Carl Barks. I didn't know anything about Donald Duck. They seemed like kids' comics to me. But he insisted that these were great comics. And he was no comics fan or anything else. He was a casual reader, but he was telling me that, he enjoyed these when he was a kid. And, Barks was very prolific, through the late 40s, all through the 50s and into the early 60s. And basically created comic book writing. I mean, other writers of the time period would look at his work as the high bar, writers like John Stanley. And I'm sure Stan Lee and Hank Chapman and Gardner Fox, they were probably all looking at these books because, first of all, they sold huge. They sold in the millions each month. And they knew kids are responding to them. And all you have to do is read one story and you can see the craft. This guy, has the craft by the short hairs. He understands this medium because he helped create this medium. Because comic book stories, he realized, aren't just a series of comic strips that you read in the paper. They actually have to hold together better. And the page has to be laid out in a different way. And the stories have to be constructed in a different way. You need a beginning and a middle and an end, and you don't have the weeks and weeks and weeks that a comic strip has to build these stories. You've got, at most 32 pages. Many times he would divide these issues into, several stories. Um, but he would, and the stories are actually funny, which is another plus. Comedy is hard to write, but he does it so well. And there's a couple of his stories that I absolutely marvel at, where he would introduce elements early on, and then you would have enough time to forget about those elements until the end of the story, and they would be reintroduced. And he always did it in such a subtle way that you were never aware he was laying the seeds. Just an expert comic book craftsman, and anybody who works in comics needs to take a look at. I can't tell you how many times I turned to Carl Barks when I was writing Savage Sword, because the adventures of Donald and his nephews really aren't that different from the adventures of Conan the Barbarian. New lands and strange people, and strange people who are trying to kill them, and some mystery to be solved to get out of it all. So I would turn to Barks to as how to structure a plot line for a Conan story, because my Conan stories were 50 pages long. They much like Barks's longer stories had to be constructed, as a standalone saga. And there's nobody who did it better than Barks. Hope that answers your question. Levi Sweeney, is there such a thing as the superhero genre? Kevin Feige of the MCU has said no. What do you think? I think he's nuts. I think he's either lying to you or lying to himself. What other genre has an origin? I mean, all the time. I mean, yeah, we see movies. Well, if you see a Bollywood movie, every Bollywood movie has an origin for the hero, pretty much. But for the most part, you know, John Wayne or James Bond or Clint Eastwood or, Brad Pitt show up, and we don't know their background. We may learn some of their background as the movie goes on, but it's not necessarily a story about who they are or why they're doing what they're doing, to this extent, where this one life altering thing happened to them, and all of a sudden they're, potato salad man. So it's, I don't know, it's disingenuous to say that superheroes aren't a genre, because they certainly are. There's tropes and cliches and reused things. The wild action, which now has, superhero action has spread to almost every movie. I mean, the last few Fast and Furious movies, the last couple of Star Trek movies have basically been superheroes. It's pushed the action quotient up to 11, and it kind of stays there. But that begins with comics, and that's part of a superhero movie. I mean, when we see a character in what's supposed to be a thriller set in the real world, fall 10 stories and get up and walk away, that's a superhero element taken from the superhero genre and borrowed for another genre. And then you've got the ultimate battle between good and evil. Yeah, there's good guys and bad guys in every movie, from the silent era on, but not like in a superhero movie where the battle between good and evil has to be won. Otherwise, the entire Earth, the entire universe, is facing a existential crisis. And even in a James Bond movie, the difference between the good guys and the bad guys isn't as sharply drawn as it is in a superhero film. It's just part of the genre. You've also got heightened emotion, the range of emotions in a superhero story, even in the films. It's just way beyond uh, normal human relations. Again, turned up to 11. When the characters are sad, they're really, really sad. They're devastatingly devastated. They're just ruined. And when they're happy, they're just way too happy. Larry Hama said that comics are grand opera, and that's it. They are. Everything's overblown, bigger than life. Uh, Emotions, visuals, powers, relationships, everything is huge and big and broad. And there's soap opera elements as well. You know, tearjerker stories, and you know, overcomplicated human relationships with the secret identities and all the rest of it. You know, you look at Spider-Man, and it's a huge soap opera, and the soap opera part of Spider-Man was actually the draw. It's what brought you back every month. You know, yeah, you told yourself, I want to see him fight this new villain who's on the cover, but really you wanted to find out, what's going on with him and Mary Jane. Are they going to get back together? Is he ever going to tell her? That kind of thing. But what we have to remember in the end is it's a kid's medium. These are childhood wish fulfillment fantasies, which make them different than any other film genre. Um, you know, Even different than kids' movies, because they have a, um, a core understanding all their own. So yeah, superhero movies are a genre. Unless they go to break the genre, in which case, to me, it's no longer a superhero movie. Even if they're running around in capes and boots, and you've broken it, you're not using the superhero tropes. It's not really a superhero movie anymore. It's an allegory or a pastiche of some kind. But you know, God forbid, and I guess that's what they're trying to do, is grow the superhero genre up, because we've seen how that's gone in comics, and it's not good. It's not good. As they tried to grow superheroes up, the readership fell away, because that's not what they want. Because remember, it's about kids. In the end, it's about the kids, and certainly their marketing department understands that, and their merchandising departments. Scott McCullough, hey Scott. Chuck, would you tell us about your hobby and share with us your love of collecting plastic toy soldiers and painting miniature armies? Perhaps show us some pieces from your collection. Do you have a favorite Mark set? I saved this question for last because probably most of you are going to go, out the hell with this and tune out. Uh, anyway, yeah, Marks was a company when I was a kid. Every boy had a Marks playset or two in their house. The biggie being the Civil War set, the blue and gray set, which was one of my first Marks sets, and I just played this thing to death. Another favorite for me was the Untouchable set. Unbelievably, Marx made a play set about Prohibition era gangsters. And as you can see, it was kind of violent. There's a guy laying dead, there's a guy getting shot. They had a warehouse full of booze, friction powered touring cars, a little street set up where they could, gun each other down. They even have a flapper and a little Al Capone figure. Those were different days. But my favorite Mark set of all was the Rifleman. Came with a Rifleman ranch and cattle and bad guys to shoot at, and horses and fences, and of course, Lucas McCain and his son. Uh, to me, growing up, it was toy soldiers and comic books. It's all I cared about. It's all I basically still care about. But because I work in comics professionally, toy soldiers are my, childish fascination that I kept. Yeah, I do. I paint a lot of soldiers in a few different periods. I did a lot of Civil War soldiers a few years ago, Boxer Rebellion, Russian Civil War, and most recently painted a full range of Zulu War figures. Literally thousands and thousands of painted soldiers, many, many hours spent painting these things. Recently moved into the ancient Rome era. Here we have some Roman light auxiliary. And I paint them toy soldier fashion. These aren't painted miniature fashion. These are painted like the painted toy soldiers I would get at the dime store when I was a kid. I'm not a perfectionist. Just I paint armies, not soldiers. As I always say, mostly to myself because nobody else is interested. More of the Roman range. These are ancient Celts. There's Boadicea, and some of her pals. Some of my ancestors. Okay, that's it for me. If you've stayed this long through my toy soldier thing, you got to watch an ad. Unauthorized TV is the station where I can be found. There's dozens and dozens more of these videos, some of them going into much deeper depth than I go here. And as I said, it's a subscription service. So I would really appreciate if you would at least check it out. There's a couple of free videos there you can try out, and hope to see you there. Talk to you soon, and see you down the road.